Welcome back, everyone, to True Crime Life by Jess. I'm your host, Jess. Today's episode is a true crime story that meets urban legend, that meets horror. And that's why it's a bonus episode, because normally I focus on stories about women offenders and the crimes that they commit and how they committed them and the why behind it. And I also cover cases of unsolved homicides and missing person cases. But today, I wanted to change things up a little and do something just a little different for y'all. So my 12-year-old son actually brought this one to my attention. For those who don't know, I do have a TikTok page. I do some videos there, and I have a series on there called Ruining Your Hometown. And those are stories of true crime that happened in random towns that people request. And I find a case and I do a short little, anywhere from 2 minutes to 6 minute video just about that case. It's very condensed. So I actually did do a much shorter version of this story that we're going to talk about today on that TikTok page. But my son had mentioned seeing a trailer for a movie called Bunny Man Massacre or something like that on YouTube. And he wanted to know if it was based on a true story or not. So I investigated it. And much to my surprise, while the current lore around the Bunny Man, especially the movies, has been outrageously horrified and changed over time, it does appear to have actually come from real events that happened in 1970. So, needless to say, my son thought it was very interesting, and he has informed me that moving forward, he will let me know anytime he comes across something that he thinks I should do a podcast episode on. So stay tuned, because I'll be doing some more bonus episodes that combine horror and true crime for those of you who are like me and are fans of both. And if you're not, then just don't listen to the horror bonus episodes. Or do, because you might find it interesting, because there's still true crime. So before we dive into this story and the case today, I just want to take a moment to remind everybody to follow the podcast on whatever app you're listening to, subscribe, run over to my Facebook page, The True Crime Life by Jess, to follow me there. I post updates and additional details and pictures for each episode. And occasionally, I'll even throw some polls on there to get an idea of what people want me to cover next. And even beyond that, if you ever have an idea for a podcast episode that you'd like to see me cover, send me an email at truecrimewifebyjess@gmail.com. Or you can even DM me on the Facebook page. I'd love to get ideas from all of you, because you are the listeners. And this podcast is, fun for me to put together because I enjoy the research and I like to talk. But it's also nice to have people that actually want to listen to it. So if you have ideas, let me know. I'd also like to give a shout out to my friend John. Again, I gave him a shout out on one of the last episodes because he's a huge fan of the podcast and has been very supportive, even though he lives a whole state away. And he'll actually be guest hosting with me soon, because I really need someone to talk to about the next episode. I had put a poll up on the Facebook page, and the majority vote was for me to cover the Mackenzie Shirilla case out of Strongville, Ohio. And let's just say that that is a case that I know has basically gone viral at this point. I've watched every documentary out there on the case. I've watched one of the victims' sisters, Christine Russo, go live on TikTok to discuss the case for her own podcast, Big Sister Unhinged. I'm not going to say I'm obsessed with the case, but I might be obsessed because this case is complicated and it's divisive. So stay tuned, because that one will be a doozy for sure. And it might be another two-parter, like when I covered Frank and Rose West's case, only because as those of you who have listened to me on the podcast know, I like to make sure that I'm as detailed as possible. I want to provide as much information as possible as far as, what happened, what the evidence was, how the trial went, how the sentencing went, where everybody's at now, any psychology that plays into all of this. I try to do it all. So that one could end up being a two-parter. I won't know until I actually really start to record and talk about it. And then after that, we'll be covering the Corey Richins trial. I'm in the process of going through that entire trial because the entire thing was filmed and put on Court TV on YouTube. And so I've been watching that one from start to finish. And that one is going to be a solid episode or two, maybe a two-parter for that one too, unless you want to listen to me talk for 3 hours. Now, with all of that said, let's get into today's case. And today's case starts with a white rabbit. And it's not a storybook rabbit. It's not a cute little Easter bunny. We're not talking about, Alice in Wonderland white rabbit. I'm talking about a man-sized white rabbit, or maybe a woman-sized white rabbit, or maybe something that only looked rabbit-like in the dark. I know I'm gonna end up doing it. I'm gonna end up putting weird sound effects in this. And I apologize in advance because I really enjoy horror movies and scary movies. And I also find them kind of funny because most of the time people do stupid things in them. And I'm like, why would you do that? But anyway, gonna try to stay on track here. So we're starting off with a white rabbit. And like I said, we don't know. Was it a man-sized white rabbit, a woman-sized white rabbit, or maybe just something that looked rabbit-like in the dark? Was it a person in a costume? Was it a prank? Was it someone trying to scare people away from a place they didn't want them to be? The details here are slippery. But before the bridge stories, before the ghost stories, before the murders that were added later on, there were 2 real incidents in Fairfax, Virginia. 2 reports, 2 encounters, a weapon, criminal mischief, and then decades of whispers that twisted into something almost unrecognizable. So let's go back to where it started. Let's follow the tracks and step into the woods and go down the rabbit hole. And yes, I'm going to make a lot of rabbit puns. This is the story of the Bunny Man. So the origin of the Bunny Man, it seems to have come from Fairfax, Virginia, or it seems to at least be centered around this area. And in discussing the story, we're going all the way back to 1970. In 1970, Fairfax was not quite the crowded suburban area that many people know it to be today. Parts of the county, especially around Burke, Clifton, and Fairfax Station, still had wooded, rural, isolated areas. And this matters. It matters a lot because the Bunny Man legend relies heavily on an atmosphere of dark roads, woods, construction sites, isolated homes, railroad overpasses, teenage dare stories, and the Halloween season, which is somehow always creepier in rural areas. Realistically, every good urban legend needs a place that feels like it could hide something. And in this case, Fairfax County had it all. So it was in 1970 that a newspaper article ran entitled "Man in Bunny Suit Sought in Fairfax." That was the name of the article. And this article is the first that identified any sort of bunny-related suspect or creature. And from reviewing the research, it was the start of the Bunny Man legend, at least from what I could find and what others have found who have also done extensive research on this. This particular article actually ran in the Washington Post. The article alleges that an Air Force cadet named Robert Bennett told police that shortly after midnight, the previous Sunday from when the article came out, that he and his fiancée were sitting in a car in the 5400 block of Guinea Road when a man dressed in a white suit with long bunny ears came from behind a nearby bush and shouted at them. And the guy, or the bunny man, shouted, "You're on private property and I have your tag number." So I really just imagine that maybe this was like some older gentleman who was just sick of kids making out in front of his house. At least that's what I initially thought. So the rabbit man then threw a wooden-handled hatchet. So this is where it escalated. So maybe not a guy who's just sick and tired of the bull. The rabbit man threw a wooden-handled hatchet through the right front car window before then just skipping off into the night, according to the article. And according to the article, Bennett and his fiancée were not harmed during the incident. So that's good. No injuries from this. According to that same article, the police have the hatchet, which I'll post pictures of on my Facebook page. And going to just drop a small disclaimer here that if there's randomly a loud buzzing sound, it is because where I do my podcast is like the recording. I do it in our sunroom, which is also the washer and dryer is on the other side of the room across from me, and they're both currently going. And I feel like one of the two of them are about to be done, which means that there may be a loud, obnoxious buzzing sound, which I may try to edit out later if it does happen, but I make no guarantees. I've gotten into the habit now. I just kind of hit record, throw in the intro music and the outro music, and I'm out. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So we've got a hatchet thrown through a car window, no injuries, and the police supposedly have the hatchet, at least according to some resources that I found. But what was Cadet Bennett doing with his fiancée in a car just after midnight on a Sunday night? Well, the article talks about it. So according to this article, Bennett was visiting an uncle who lived across the street from where the car was parked. And I paused there dramatically because that's it. That's all we know. Was there more to the story? We may never know. But even though Robert Bennett and his fiancée story ends there, and we know that there is a hatchet, the story didn't end there, because not long after this article ran, it was actually only 2 weeks later, another article was published. And this time, the story was a bit different and involved a completely different person seeing this alleged bunny man. So the article in question was entitled, "The Rabbit Reappears." In this article, it's reported that a man wearing a gray, black, and white rabbit suit with 2 long ears appeared around 5307 Guinea Road in Fairfax County. So we're still on the same exact road in the same county, which to me, those 2 stories, same road, maybe there's something to this, right? So this time, the rabbit man was wielding an axe instead of a hatchet, and he was chopping away at a roof support on a new house that had just been built in the area. Paul Phillips, who was a private security guard for a construction company that had been doing work in the area, was doing his patrols, doing his rounds, and he saw this rabbit guy standing on the front porch of the new unoccupied home. He went up to him to talk to him, and the rabbit man just started chopping at the roof support and continued to do it while speaking to the security guard. And according to the security guard, the rabbit man said, "All you people trespass around here. If you don't get out of here, I'm going to bust you on the head." Which, that might be a little scary. So Phillips, he's a security guard, but he'd left his handgun in his car. So he walks back to his car to get the gun because the guy with an axe is threatening me. And the rabbit man at that point ran into the woods, and he was gone by the time the security guard got back. So the guard did call the police, and he described the man as 5'8", 160 pounds, and he appeared to be in like his early 20s. Although I'm still not sure how he could tell that if the man was wearing a bunny suit. I'm guessing maybe this was one of those suits where like the face is still visible, and it's not like one of like those mask ones. Although I'm really not sure which is more terrifying at this point. But so that's that second article. So that's what we have from these 2 articles is what I am considering and what has been considered the beginning of the bunny man legend. And I say legend because despite there being 2 newspaper articles regarding these alleged incidents, most research papers about all of this note that there are no official records held by the Fairfax County Police Department regarding the assault on Robert Bennett and his fiancée. So it's possible that they didn't report it to the police and that they just went to the newspapers to report it. But according to the newspaper articles, if it did occur, it occurred on October 18th, 1970. However, there is a police report related to vandalism on October 29th, and the report for that incident states that at 10:30 p.m. on October 29th, 1970, 6 officers responded to 5307 Guinea Road for a suspect dressed as a rabbit with an axe. Granted, when they got on scene, there was no rabbit, but the case was handed over to investigator W.L. Johnson of the Criminal Investigations Bureau. So there's an actual police case investigation related to that newspaper article. So from what I found, according to the resources out there, Investigator Johnson began his investigation by visiting the construction offices of the Kings Park West subdivision on October 31st. So that was the kind of the subdivision where this had all taken place. And again, he found no rabbit, no evidence of a rabbit. But he did receive a call after his visit from someone who worked at Kings Park West. The caller claimed to have just received a phone call from someone identifying himself as the Axeman. And the man said, "You've been messing up my property by dumping tree stumps, limbs, and brush and other things on the property. You can make everything right by meeting me tonight and talking about the situation." So that's what this Axeman had supposedly told the employee. Now, according to the employee, the caller sounded like a white male in his late teens or early 20s. So the police set up a stakeout, hoping maybe this guy's actually going to show up. But the Axeman never appeared. On November 4th, 1970, Investigator Johnson received a call from a resident in the area who informed him that her son claimed to know who the Bunny Man was. She stated that some of the neighborhood children had actually seen the Bunny Man, and they described him as an older teenager. So we do have some consistencies here. We've got everyone consistently saying that the Bunny Man, whoever it was, is described very similarly as far as age, gender, height, and that kind of stuff. And he seems to be very against people trespassing or damaging property. Unless it's him, he's allowed to chop at things. So, Investigator Johnson ended up interviewing multiple neighborhood children, including this 8-year-old boy. But the 8-year-old boy admitted that he hadn't actually met the Bunny Man. He had just heard about him at school. And the multiple neighborhood children that the investigator spoke with also said the same thing. They didn't actually know who he was. They had either just seen him or heard about him. Ultimately, on March 14th, 1971, Investigator Johnson summarized the case as unsubstantiated, and he noted in his summary that the only people who had seen the so-called rabbit were the complainant, in this case, referring to the security guard, and then multiple children. So there's no way at this time, to know if there is or was not a white rabbit. He then marked the case as inactive. And that was it. Only that wasn't it, because even though the official case was closed, the legend continued. Because a story about a man dressed as a bunny hacking away at houses with an axe, or attacking a couple with a hatchet, or showing up in random places to scare children isn't a story that just goes away. It gets latched onto, and then the story gets told and retold. And each retelling made it a little bigger, creepier, and more dramatic. It was essentially like playing the telephone game. The one where everyone stands in a line and one person whispers something to the first person, and then that person has to whisper the same thing to the next person, and so on and so forth. And then by the time whatever was said reaches the last person, it's often very different from what was originally said. And that's how this legend most likely got so inflated. The report of, quote, a man who threw a hatchet becomes, he attacks people with an axe. And then the portion about the Bunny Man yelling about trespassing at the couples, or the portion where the Bunny Man guy is like yelling at the couple about trespassing, turned into, he hunts trespassers. And then he wore a bunny suit becomes, he was a deranged killer in a blood-covered rabbit costume. The fact he was seen near roads and construction areas turned into, he must live under a bridge. Don't know why, but that's where this goes. We'll talk about this. And of course, no one knew who he was or ever figured out who he was. So that turned into, he escaped from an asylum. And yeah, there is more. And that's how folklore works. It takes the weirdest real details and builds an entire nightmare around it, which is how we ended up with the bigger, crazier stories that have become motion pictures. So let's talk about one of the inflated stories that is part of the lore that can be found online about the Bunny Man. So we're going to talk about the Bunny Man Bridge, because those actual events that happened, first of all, had nothing to do with the bridge. But like I said, the fact that he was coming out of bushes, hanging out at construction sites, the assumption became that he lived under a bridge for some reason. I don't know why, but that's what it turned into. So in this case, or this story, the legend became attached to the Colchester Overpass in Clifton, Virginia, which is now commonly called Bunny Man Bridge. They even have a Bunny Man brewery nearby, from what I have read. So, something to note though, the Bunny Man sightings that we talked about from 1970 didn't even take place anywhere near this bridge. The original incidents were associated with the Guinea Road, Burke area, which is miles away from the bridge. But with the retelling of the story, the bridge kind of became the focus of the legend. Even today, teenagers go there at night on dares. People will tell each other not to go there after midnight. There's rumors that you'll see the Bunny Man there on Halloween. People even claim that bodies have been found there. Now, there have actually been Halloweens where there were so many people attempting to visit the bridge that police had to put up a road check area for traffic control. Yeah, the legend is that popular and widespread. Now, the bridge basically became the movie set for the legend. It gave the story a kind of creepy, physical landmark, somewhere people could drive to, dare each other to visit, and scare themselves half to death with. But the bridge lore didn't end with he just lives under the bridge. And this is where we're going to add in the asylum. So, according to journalist Matt Blitz, who grew up in Fairfax County, I read about him in an article that I was reading while doing research for this episode. Matt Blitz, he always heard the story as a kid, and according to him, it started in 1904. According to the story, there was an asylum not far from the bridge, and the residents of the town didn't like the idea of mental patients being near their new home, so they got it shut down. This meant the patients had to be taken someplace else, so they were being transferred to Lorton Prison on a bus. According to the story that Blitz tells, the bus swerved and crashed, and they were able to locate all of the inmates except for one. This patient or inmate even had a name, Douglas Griffin. And of course, after the crash, he disappeared. Because why not? But apparently, he was also eating bunnies to stay alive because as the weeks passed, there were bunny corpses found in the woods. Now, according to the story, one Halloween night, a group of kids were hanging around the bridge, and they saw some sort of bright light or a flash, and then all of a sudden they'd all been strung up like bunnies and were gutted and hanging from the bridge. And of course, the mental patient, Douglas Griffin, was assumed to be the killer. The rumor then goes that if you go there on Halloween night at midnight, you'll end up just like those kids and those bunnies. Okay, so that's a pretty creepy, gory story, right? But again, it's lore built around events that aren't possible and didn't happen, other than what we've already discussed. First of all, there has never been an asylum in Clifton. Not that I could find. There are also no records indicating any bus accident or accident involving inmates or mental patients ever occurred in that area. So hopefully I'm not bursting anyone's bubble here as I completely ruin this amazing legend. I'm sure that some of you were probably like, oh, I hope it's real, but it's not. And there really isn't anything to substantiate any of the claims. But as far as like the real historical record goes, the asylum escape story is where we leave true crime and fully enter campfire story territory. Because I feel like just about every horror story or campfire story seems to include someone who escaped from a mental hospital and went on a murder rampage, which realistically isn't how that would work out. Most people in mental hospitals aren't deranged maniacs. So stories like that aren't supported by facts, and it's not supported by the actual documented Bunny Man report. So that's my soapbox on that. And then now we get into the even darker variations of the Bunny Man, if it could get even any darker. I mean, the whole bridge strung up, gutted thing is pretty dark. But let's talk about the horror films, because that's what led my son to bringing it up to me and then me doing this research into it. Let me just say, these horror films, there are way more of them than I thought. I was thinking like it was like a one and done. It is like a whole franchise of Bunny Man killer movies. I did sit down and watch one of them, the Bunny Man Massacre, which I thought was the first, but ended up being the second one from 2014. If you haven't watched it and plan to and don't want spoilers, you might want to fast forward through this first little part because I'm going to give a little bit of a spoiler. mostly just from the very beginning of the movie. So the movie started out from the very beginning with the white rabbit guy, big white costume, and a ton of gore. There's a school bus stopped at a bus stop. There's a young girl sitting on a bench. And it's very clear that she's dead. She's just kind of like sitting there unresponsive, like staring straight ahead. And then she just like leans over and like falls. And the bus driver is like sitting there staring at her, going like, oh, that kid might be dead. And the bus driver, it was ridiculous. The bus driver's just sitting there, like staring at her, like, excuse me, are you alive? Are you alive? And it's like, no, she's not alive. That girl is dead. Like she's gone, dunno. And then while she's staring at this girl on the bench, you see the guy in the white rabbit suit walking around the bus, coming up to the driver's side, and he's got a shotgun, or no, a chainsaw. It was a chainsaw. And he comes up to the driver's side, kills the bus driver. The kids start freaking out. There's a bus full of kids. And then he gets on the bus. He walks around, gets on the bus with the chainsaw, and just starts hacking at the kids on the bus. And it's a school bus. It was pretty gory. I like horror movies. I wasn't a fan of this part, mostly just because it involved kids. And I was like, this is a little extreme. They didn't really show too much. It was just a lot of like blood sprays and stuff. But I was like, it's maybe not a franchise that I would sit there and watch, but worth the look if you're interested in the story. I did find it interesting that it included, there's a bus. Granted, it was a school bus and not like a asylum bus or something. But that's how it starts out, and like I won't ruin it beyond that for you. But the point of it is, there's a lot of death in these movies. There's a rabbit man and there's a chainsaw, so lots of blood, a lot of blood. So the reason that we kind of talk about the movie is, one, because that's how I even came across this whole thing. So it extends the legend. So we go from a guy dressed as a bunny with a hatchet, and that's kind of scary, especially in the middle of the night. And then now we have a later legend with a chainsaw and a lot of blood and a body count. The horror versions of this story make it into a full slasher film and make this bunny man guy into a full slasher villain. But the original case was more like a bizarre unsolved property crime with a costume choice that went completely off the rails, because that's basically what it was. So we've got these two articles that actually happened, or at least one that we know for sure happened, because there's also a police report to corroborate it. And then we have another possible story that happened before that one that was in the newspapers. And then we have the stories, like the campfire stories that kids tell each other, and then the Colchester Bridge, and the story that has kind of come from these original stories and turned that into the focal point. And then we have these bunny man horror films that are very graphic and gory and lots of blood. So let's talk about the points from this. This story shows how quickly facts can mutate. It's important to separate real victims and real reports from legends, which I think we've done here. The original incidents were very serious and scary, but they weren't murders. So again, we had property crimes and basically trespassing, whatever crimes, turned now into this murder story. And the later stories, like we've talked about, they're fascinating as folklore, but they really shouldn't be treated as fact. And sometimes the truth is, sometimes the truth isn't less fascinating or less interesting. It's just different. And I think that was the case here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been like, I want to do a whole podcast of talking. I don't want, my goodness, I cannot talk. If it wasn't interesting, I wouldn't have been like, I'm going to do a whole full podcast episode on this. I found it very interesting because we have these movies that, and part of the premise on some of the Bunny Man movies is it says based on a true story. Woo! When it's not. I think that's what actually made my son be like, is it really based on a true story? Well, not really, but kind of. Like, yeah, there was like a Bunny Man guy in the news, back in the 70s, but it wasn't real, like as far as blood and gore and stuff. It was, get off my property or else I'm going to throw this hatchet at you. And then some guy that was hacking away at a house. I mean, it's not like the film portrayed it. And then, of course, like if you're local to the area down there in Fairfax, then you may have heard the Bunny Man story. So the real Bunny Man case isn't a massacre. It's not a confirmed serial killer story or a guy under a bridge story or even an actual escape from an asylum story. It's simply two very strange reports from 1970 that became the seed for decades of horror. So, what do you guys think? Is it possible that I'm missing something with this story? Maybe something that wasn't reported in the newspapers or that the police never got wind of. Do you think that the Bunny Man is real? What do you think the motive even was for this guy, whoever this guy was back in 1970 who dressed up like a rabbit? I mean, what was up with that? Yeah, personally, I believe that this guy existed. But I don't believe that he was like a bridge haunting, body hanging, escape patient murder ghost that the legend turned him into. It's a lot of folklore and urban legend. And like I said, even though it's not real, it's still pretty neat. And it made my true crime / horror brain very happy when I was researching. Like I said, I'm definitely going to look to do some more deep dives into some cases like this because, when it starts out as like an actual true crime, even if it's just a simple crime like property crime, maybe a murder, and then it escalates into urban legend that's way out of control. It's interesting. It's interesting to see how it's transformed over time and how it got to where it is. So if you know of any, let me know. And I'm sure that my son will be letting me know when he comes across some because he was very excited to know that I was going to do an episode on this. And don't forget, if you have an unsolved homicide or a missing persons case that you'd like to see me cover, or if you know of a female offender case that I should investigate and cover on the podcast, email me at truecrimewifebyjess@gmail.com. And spread the word about the podcast. Like, tell people, like, Jess is awesome. Go listen to her. Or don't. That's okay too. But either way, if you liked this episode of True Crime Wife by Jess, please give me a good review on whatever app you're listening to because it helps the show grow so that more people can hear weird stories like this one, along with the other stories that I cover. And don't forget, for additional information about the Bunny Man story or any other episodes that I post, check out the show notes and head on over to my Facebook page, The True Crime Wife by Jess, and stay tuned for the next episode where we talk about Mackenzie Shirilla and the craziness around all of that. I hope that you enjoyed this bonus episode as much as I enjoyed making it. This story may not have ended in a high body count, but it did end with dark roads, a strange figure, and enough unanswered questions for the story to grow some teeth. And yes, that's another bunny reference because of their two little front teeth and they're so cute. But as always, don't forget that sharing matters, awareness matters. And when it comes to when it comes to stories like this, separating fact from folklore matters too. Because once you go down the rabbit hole, you never really know what's waiting at the bottom. This is Jess, and I'll see you next time.